go.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Writer Mother Monster. I'm your host, Laura Ehrlich, and our guest today is Margaret Adams. Before I introduce Margaret, thank you all for tuning in, and please chat with us during the interview. We'll weave your comments and questions into the conversation. And if you enjoy the episode, please consider becoming a patron or patroness to help me keep the podcast going. Now I'm excited to introduce Margaret. Margaret Adams writes short fiction, creative nonfiction, and essays. She's a fiction editor for JMWW, and she was a Best American Essays 2019 notable, the winner of the Blue Mesa Review 2018 Nonfiction Contest, and the winner of the Pacifica Literary Review 2017 Fiction Contest. She's also been published in a number of places that you can check out on the website. Originally from Maine, Margaret currently lives in the Navajo Nation, where she works as a family nurse practitioner. She has one child who is 11 months old, born during the pandemic, and she describes writer motherhood in 3 words as still very new. So please join me in welcoming Meg.
Hi, thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for joining me. So tell me first about those 3 words, still very new. I mean, it's kind of obvious. You had your little one during the pandemic.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't feel like I have the authority to speak on this as much as I would like to. And I also don't know what it is like for me yet, because it's been such a weird year. And I have a feeling that I'm going to just keep saying that, right? Like, oh, he's only 8. I'm sure I'll be figuring this out. I'm like, oh, he's only 15. I'm sure I'll be figuring this out. So yeah, it still feels new, and I have a feeling that it's not going to go away.
Yeah, it's funny how I hear that from so many other women on this show. You guys who are listening know that, like, people, like you said, with 15-year-olds, 25-year-olds, all are still learning how to be a mother. So I think your experience is just as valid as anyone else's. Tell me what it was like, though, to be pregnant and to have a child and then to have a newborn during the pandemic.
Yeah. So I live and work at a hospital. In 2018, I moved from Seattle, where I had been working as a primary care provider part-time and writing part-time, to the Arizona-New Mexico border, to a hospital in the middle of the Navajo Nation, which is where I live right now. And so I live in hospital housing. As a not Native person, I live in this housing that's for hospital employees, because I can't, live anywhere else on the reservation. And so it was a really unique place to be during the pandemic, when the pandemic started. There's this hospital compound with the emergency room and the clinics shut down by the end of March. And we had checkpoints set up and temperature checks and just going in and out of, and the Navajo Nation went on lockdown. I know the pandemic has been a very different experience for many people, region to region, and the nation that I'm in has took it very seriously, with good reason, because it was a particularly hard hit area. But there were curfews. You couldn't be on the road. You couldn't drive after 5 p.m. and before 8 a.m. or on the weekends. And, I have to drive like 7 miles to get my mail. When I first moved here, I was like, I am a cyclist, because I had been living in the city and bike commuting for like a decade at that point. And I was like, I'm keeping my identity as a cyclist. And I tried to like bike to the post office and totally wiped out on cattle guards. And it just was like, okay, no, I'm living rurally again. This is car culture. So, when you have a curfew system like that, it was very isolating. So it was an interesting time to be pregnant. I'd never been pregnant before, and I'd never, lived through a pandemic before either. So there was a lot of weird overlap, and I really can't pull those 2 experiences apart, right? was like, today I was anxious and lonely and ate weird things I found in the back of my pantry. It's like pregnancy or pandemic. Like that could go either way.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't pregnant during the pandemic, and that is exactly what I did too.
Yeah.
So, and I have been pregnant before, not in a pandemic, and that's what I did then too. So who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Yeah. So something that I know you wanted to talk about, which kind of fits in here, is the anxiety of having kids. So the anxiety that if we were to become mothers before we got pregnant, that we would then no longer be writers. And yeah. So tell me a little bit about that, about the pressure not to have kids if we're going to be a serious writer.
I remember when you first started tweeting about wanting to do this interview series, I got out my pen and paper because I had been keeping a list. And I think you had mentioned that you'd had a list like this too, of women writers you knew who were also mothers. Mm-hmm. I found the more outwardly serious about writing I became, the more I started encountering kind of either overt or implicit pressure not to have kids if you were going to be serious about it. I think writing, maybe other arts are like this, maybe other jobs are like this, other pursuits are like this, but there's this kind of feeling that if you're going to do it, you need to sacrifice kind of everything on the altar of that. And I have always felt a little bit like something of an outsider because I don't work in publishing and I don't have an MFA and I don't work in academia. So I already had that kind of feeling that maybe I was spread a little too thin in some ways. And I know this is kind of a big tangent. I don't
please keep
totally. I think that having a job where I can work part-time that supports my writing, I feel like I'm kind of constantly underwriting my own residency in that way. And so that's how that math works for me. But that was a math that I had to come to with a decent amount of self-doubt and decision-making and talking to a lot of people and deciding, yes, this is, I've started on this path in this way and I'm okay with sticking with it. And I had cut down to part-time work in medicine, and that was a really good balance for me. And then I was at this crossroads thinking of throwing in being a mother. And I really leaned on that list where I was like, okay, well, look at these people and they're making it work. Because so many more people in my life were saying oh, well, obviously if you're going to be serious about being a writer, you're not also going to have kids. I was at a writing residency and I'd been kind of feeling it out for a year and a half and started talking about it too. I was like, yeah, maybe I'm going to have a kid soon. I might do that soon. And one of the residency directors was like, well, I thought you were serious about this. I was like, that's it. I'm going out and getting pregnant. Right now is my giant act of rebellion, which is so funny to see the framing on that, because I feel like outside of the writing community, most women I know talk about the opposite thing where, they have pressure to have kids and having a kid could be for them a unexamined or more conventional choice. And for me, it was okay, this is my rebellion. I'm going to do this. And I'm glad that I have. I don't know how rebellious it really was or wasn't, but.
Yeah, but no, so all of that resonates with me, obviously. And I remember you shared your list with me, and some of those women on the list have since been on the show, or are going to be on the show. But yes, having those examples was really vital to me too, of yes, you can do it. You can be a serious writer and a good mother, and layering in a challenging day job as well. And you and I share the fact that I don't have an MFA or a job in publishing or in academia either. And you're right. Now that you mentioned that, I had the same feeling of already kind of being an outsider or having those things those things that are signposts of being serious in the industry, right? And if you don't have them, and then you also have a child, it's like, well, is that like the last straw of being a serious writer? But so have you found sense, and I want to come back to this, but have you found sense that that you've been able to continue writing?
I have. So, I mean, a funny thing happened. A lot of people, when I first started telling other writers that I was expecting a child, and I was mostly sharing that with other writers who had children, I got a lot of advice to not even like try to do that much in the first year. They were like, just let yourself off the hook now and don't do it. Mm-hmm. And there is this pressure, right? You talk to plenty of people who are like, okay, I'm expecting a child, so I'm going to write that thing like in the next few months. And I was trying not to do that. It may have been a role in this, but once I found out I was pregnant, I finally completed a first draft of a novel, my first full draft of any novel. And this was something I had been trying to do for a few years. And it felt like deciding to have a baby and committing to that was like the facial tattoo of life decisions. And after that, all of these things that I had been wary of committing to, like plot choices, were just like, that's nothing. Like I can just churn plot out because who cares? It was such a lower pressure thing. So I got a lot done, during my pregnancy. And then I was still working on that project and continued to get a decent amount done in the first 6-7 months of being a mother. Part of that was I had a really long maternity leave, which was really helpful. And I'm starting to slow down a little, and I can't tell if it's, life, going back to work, or that kind of natural pause in projects that happens where you get stuck for a bit. And I'm still trying to feel out where I need to go with it now.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, congratulations on finishing the draft. That is huge.
Especially everyone always, it's hard for me to find somebody who doesn't also say that you have to write a novel and throw it out to write another one. So I'm like, listen, worst case scenario, if I throw this out, like at least I will have done that.
Yeah. Well, you also had someone tell you shouldn't have kids. So
I know.
maybe people are wrong when they say these like all-encompassing pieces of advice. So
that's fair.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, and I have thoughts about which one it was the person who said that to you at a residency a man or a woman instructor?
It was a woman.
That's what I would have
said that. Yeah. I think women are more familiar with the pressures and expectations. And I'm just going to generalize a lot here about gender and parenthood and broad strokes and exceptions to all of this. But I think there's more pressure put on women in their role as mothers than there is pressure for men. At least as far as what society throws at you. I found that 3 years before I was ready to become a mother, I was like, I could totally become a dad right now. I am ready for that. I can handle that. It took a little bit longer for me to feel like I was ready to be a mother because there's so much expectation attached to that. And I've actually found it really useful to spend time with writer dads because maybe they have less is expected of them, but they also have less internalized bullshit on unnecessary expectations. And so, there's so much, many of them seem so much more able to be like, and today I made time for my writing and I am still a good parent, and not have a complex over that. And sometimes that's fun energy to be around and attempt to appropriate for my own.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as you know, as a listener and now a participant on the podcast, almost every woman here has talked about shame and guilt and the
Yeah.
the shame of closing the door, right? And like leaving your child on the other side. And again, like not to generalize, but the fact that now almost 35 women have said the same thing. There's something there, right? This angst that is possibly unique to writer mother monsters. So tell me a little bit more about that.
I listen to a lot of podcasts that are interviews with writers, part of the whole like DIY MFA effort that I've been trying to do for a decade now. And initially I listened to like almost exclusively women because women's lives were more interesting to me, and like I'm sure like a very self-absorbed way, but you know, whatever. I was more interested in the women writers. So I was listening to the women writers. And at one point I listened to an interview with a male writer for the first time in like 3 years, right? And it was because it was somebody's spouse. So I was interested in them, and I was like, oh, well, I'll follow over and listen to their spouse too. And the questions that the interviewer asked them were so different. And it was really startling to me. There was no like, well, and what did your family think of that? You know, and those questions are like, how do you balance, you know, your creative life with your family? Those are questions that get asked a lot of women writers, and they're questions that a lot of us want the answers to, right? So, you know, I'm here for that question, but those questions don't get asked of male writers in the same way. And you know this. I mean, I know that that's the whole reason why you have this space to talk about this sort of thing. But yeah, sometimes it's been fun for me to tab over and listen to those interviews and try to appropriate it a little and see how that feels to kind of be a little more unapologetic and not have to be asked to account for leading a creative life and also having family and balancing that.
How does it feel?
Yeah, it's kind of fun sometimes. I mean, it feels like a costume sometimes, where I'm like, oh, I'm pretending this isn't a thing. But there is something to be said. I don't know. This feels very similar to a phenomenon that I started in Seattle. I started lying sometimes when I wanted to go take writing time. I would tell my housemates that I was picking up an extra shift at the urgent care. And it didn't make a difference to them, you know, and it was one of those things like explaining to a non-writer why on a Friday night you're going to go to the public library to go work on a book that they're not going to see in the next 2 weeks. Like non-writers find that very confusing. And at some point, you know, someone in my life was like, wow, this seems like a lot of work for a hobby. And I was like, oh God, don't even start on that road with me. There's a lot that I could say about that too. And I wish that I had the full gumption and confidence to just say, I am going writing and taking this time. But I have a limited store of energy. And at a certain point, I just embrace saying I picked up an extra shift in a way that people understand. And then thinking, you know, like I wish that I had the confidence and energy to not say that right now, but it sure does work. It's one less thing to have to think about.
And it is work, right? I mean, it's work. It's not the urgent care, but it is an extra shift essentially of work. Yeah. So that is maybe not quite a lie.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So just a sort of tangent from motherhood, but tell me a little bit more about being a writer and a health practitioner, and what that looks like, because I think that's such a unique combination. As you mentioned, so many people who are serious writers are also in academia or have are in publishing. So tell me about this sort of dual career that you have.
Yeah, well, so I started writing in my early 20s. I started writing probably sooner than that too, but I knew that I wanted to take it seriously when I was in college, and I did a BA straight out of high school. And after I did that, I did a series of seasonal jobs for a while. So I mean, my first job out of college, I went to Antarctica, and I worked at South Pole Station as a heavy equipment operator and a general assistant in a mechanics shop. And that was really fun and very much, not necessarily something that my BA had prepared me for. And I was able to do a lot of writing around that. And it fed a need that I had to be doing something that was very like concrete and immediate and tactile. And I did that for a few years, and I was realizing that I wanted to write more, but I also needed something to anchor me. And I went to nursing school because I was interested in nursing, but honestly, just as much because I was interested in having a job that I could do that would be like concrete and pragmatic and could be turned towards social justice purposes and would pay me enough that I could do it part-time. So I could write.
Yeah.
And then the longer I have stuck with that, I went from RN to nurse practitioner. It's been very helpful for me constitutionally. I'm actually not as much of an introvert as I think many writers are. And so I like getting out of the house and talking to a lot of people. And I'm very prone to getting very into my head, like way too into my head. And so working in healthcare means that I have to I can't, it's not just navel gazing, right? Like I have to literally look at other people's belly buttons multiple times a day when I go into work, and then it helps me get into a different space, and it keeps me balanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Just the belly button trajectory there was brilliant. Yeah. I was stunned by that. So struck dumb. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear that the writing came first, and then the medical career was in support of the writing. And I feel like often, at least those I've heard who are writers and in medicine, it's sort of the opposite, right? That people have a medical career. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, now I have something to write about, and now I want to write.
Yeah. I hear that a lot too. And I will run into other medical writer people, and I do this weird dance where I'm always like, oh, no, I'm a writer medical person, not a medical writer person. And I appreciate you articulating it the way you did, because I have not been able to articulate that as well in the moment when I'm trying to do this like weird distinction. It's because there is like a subgenre of people who write about medicine, and it's a place that can be pretty fraught. I think on one of your recent, I think it was Kendra was talking about on one of your recent interviews was talking about having worked teaching in prisons and not wanting to write about that, and was talking about like the witnesshood writing. I find a lot of medical writing can be witnesshood writing, and that makes sense because so much of medicine involves a lot of secondary trauma and a lot of these vicarious experiences that people then write about. And I find that to be something that I frequently want to do and don't want to do, and it's compelling and fraught. Yeah. I sometimes, so, I have two ways where I can swing this for myself as much as for anyone else. One is I made this really pragmatic decision on how I was going to support myself as a writer. And the other one is that I didn't have the courage or the confidence to just be like, I want to be a writer, so I'm going to do writing full time. I think for my personality, and I'm very happy that I've picked the way that I have, but I also have moments sometimes where I'm like, ooh, an MFA, that looks like so much fun.
Yeah. I hear you on that. So let's talk about writing full time, because I think it's such a dream, right? And I think every writer is excuse me, every writer kind of starts writing, and you have that book or the project, and you're like, okay, now I'm going to write full time. And then the more you learn about the industry, the more you're like, okay, that's sort of a pipe dream for most people. So we do need a secondary job, whether it's teaching or whatever else. So I think pragmatic, yes, but also very smart, right? To think so early on, like, I want to be a writer. How can I support that? Because it will probably take a while to be able to write full time.
Yeah. It's a hard thing to figure out what works for you too. And I think different things work at different times. I've told myself a lot of stories about how I'm best able to write. And, for years I've told myself the story. So when I lived in cities for, 10, 15 years, I lived in Baltimore and Seattle and Madrid. And I would write almost exclusively at coffee shops or libraries. And then I moved out to the Navajo reservation in 2018. And I don't have coffee shops or libraries that are very accessible. I can drive 45 minutes to New Mexico, and there's a coffee shop there that I can go to. But that's a tough sell for like a writing session when you're looking at how much time you have blocked. And after that, it's a 3-hour drive for a bookstore. And so I was learning how to write from home. And then now I am a morning person. I've always told myself I can only really write in the mornings, and surprise, I created another little morning person. And my little morning person is always up by 5. So I talk to other writer moms who are like, yeah, I just get up before them. I'm like, I can't get up at 3. That's not a thing I can do. So I'm trying to learn how to write in the evenings. But I did, before I got pregnant, I went and did 2 residencies back to back, and I was able to write full time for like 8 weeks. And it did not work for me. No. And I wrote full time for a year in my early 20s too. And I thought, that didn't work for me then, but I'll try it again now in my mid 30s. And it also didn't work. Yeah. I can't say it totally didn't work, because I did get stuff done, but I was miserable, like really miserable. I think if I had some writing days and then some non-writing days, that would be a good balance for me. But full-time writing, I think that's a struggle for me.
Is it sort of what you were saying before about being somebody who needs to be out among people? And
Yeah, I get 2 in my head. I haven't done an experiment where I see how far I go and see if I eventually get out of my head. I don't know if I want to know what that looks like.
Maybe like 10 weeks. Week 10. So tell me more about the logistics of writing. Because again, what you're saying here resonates with me. I used to get up early before work and write before I had a child, and I'd write in coffee shops, and I had routine, and it was yes, this is when I write. And then of course, when you have a child, it was the same thing. My daughter was up during my writing time, and then once she actually started sleeping during that time, she became an evening child. And so then I was like, okay, so now my evening routine doesn't work anymore. So it's kind of that shifting and the need to become a flexible writer. And I never would have thought that for myself early on, when I was so regimented about, because you hear that old philosophy, right? Write at the same time every day and write for 2 hours or whatever. So how did motherhood, or you've touched on this, but tell me a little bit more about the kind of writer you've become since you've become a mother.
Yeah, I have access to really wonderful, affordable childcare. And so I've been giving myself these 3-hour blocks a couple times a week to write. And there's a lot of pressure on those blocks, and I haven't yet figured out how to use them as well as I would like to. Talking to a lot of other people who don't have a ton of time to write, they do a lot of thinking and preparation for it and planning, and then they sit down and they get done what they need to get done. It's still a work in progress for me. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm also trying to take a lot of notes when I don't have time to sit down and do anything else. And that is really helpful. That's something I did a lot when I first started working as a nurse practitioner. I worked full-time as a nurse practitioner for 2 years, which I think was important then to kind of gain clinical experience and get good at that job. But it was a very hectic time for me as a writer. And I took a lot of notes when I was very busy then. And that skill has helped now early in parenthood. But I have no routine. And I work in an emergency department, so I don't have like weekdays or weekends. I have a series of days when I never know what day of the week it is. My husband is also working in an emergency department, so he also has a weird schedule. I mean, we work evenings, mornings, nights. There's no real routine. And so, I mean, in some ways, having a baby has been almost grounding, which having had a baby is like kind of hilarious, right? You're like, oh yeah, the baby's the only one with a schedule in the house that's regular. It's like, well, that's not great.
Yeah. No, that's interesting to hear. And I've sort of found the opposite, actually. Like I used to have a very scheduled, or I used to have a schedule and like, yes, having a child is grounding, but I also like weekends don't really exist anymore, right? When you have a child, even if you had a weekend, like it's caretaking, it's not restful. You don't really have vacations anymore, right? Because you're sort of, again, caretaking. So that's interesting that having a baby grounded you and your husband and like created somewhat of a...
I mean, it's been chaos. I will say that. It's just chaos where, one person in the house is supposed to be sleeping at certain times.
Mm-hmm.
That does not mean that my child is sleeping at those times, but he's, there's the aspiration there.
Oh, yeah. That's all we can do is have aspirations. So we have a question from Anna Childs, which this is a good time to bring this up. So she's interested in the intersection of writing and medicine. Does one impact the other more? It's a good question.
Yeah, I was a writer before I was in medicine. And so I definitely, I feel more strongly in that role, not as confident in that role. I feel like being a writer, there's always, it's pretty amorphous, right? And I think, I'm like, everyone's like, once I get one piece published, I'll feel like a real writer. And like, oh, once I get like a book published, I'll feel like a real writer. And like, oh, once I get, that review, I'll feel like a real writer. So, this many years in, I don't feel like a real writer because the bar is always moving. I do feel like a real nurse practitioner, but I feel more grounded in being a writer. And so, being a writer working in medicine, it's a lot of making narratives and talking to people about their narratives. I think it's a little helpful. It certainly makes it extremely enjoyable, and enjoying it is definitely helpful. Medicine, it's impossible not to get material from medicine for the writing. And so for a long time, I really resisted being like a medical writer, because that is a thing, that is a subgenre. But I can't not write about it, because there's so much there, and it is very interesting to me. And so I pull a lot from medicine and put it into my writing, content wise. And I'm not talking about like, specific patient stories, but it's such a weird place of human interaction, right? Where you're like strangers, but it's also very intimate. And it's very high stakes, that it lends itself to material for writing very easily and very quickly. Wow. I find it to be a really productive intersection for both. I don't know if being a writer makes me better at medicine, but it makes me enjoy it a lot more.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah.
How has writing changed you? Or sorry, how has motherhood changed your writing? Like the content of your writing or the form of your writing, if at all?
Yeah, I don't know yet. And that's a question I've been asking myself. I did notice that when I decided I wanted to become a mother, suddenly I got a lot nicer to my mother characters. A lot nicer to them. But that was before I even was a mother, right? That was in that pregnancy period when I noticed that change. And I became much more confident about making choices. I spent a lot of time with short stories and short form not wanting to take the risk of moving forward with something like a novel, thinking, if I do this and I get this far on this project and it doesn't work out, how's that going to feel? And then after I decided to, make a human, I was like, well, this feels like way less pressure. And so that got a lot easier. Those were all changes that happened before I even met my kid, though. So I don't know. I'm hoping to have a clearer answer for that in another year. I don't know if I will or not.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That might go back to the conversation at the beginning, right? Where you always feel like a new parent, no matter how old your kid is. It's like, I'm still waiting to find out how motherhood is impacting my writing. Maybe like 20 years from now, we can look back and find out. But
yeah.
I love what you're saying about the stakes of writing, of making decisions in writing, feeling less fraught, having made that big decision of having a child. And that, again, really resonates with me. It sounds like, well, I will share that I angsted over the decision to have a child or not for all the reasons that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So tell me about your decision process, if you're comfortable doing that. Like, you hinted at why you finally decided, it's like, okay, yes. I doubt it was just because of that one person.
No, it wasn't. It had been brewing for a little while. I had started talking to non-writers about the pressure that I was perceiving not to have children from within the writing world. And again, like, I don't know how much of this is perceived or not. I have some doubts on that because it was something I was nervous about. And so I tend to take, like many of us do, right? I take the thing that I am nervous about and I project it on other people, right? So if I'm nervous that this is a bad decision, if I want to do, if I have this dream of pursuing writing in a certain way to a certain point, and, I'm nervous that becoming a parent will be a problem for that. And then I talk to other writers about that and say, and I'm nervous about it, it's natural that they'll be like, yeah, maybe that's something to think about, because you're nervous about it. And I can take that and interpret it as like, they told me it was a bad idea. And like, actually, it was just me wondering out loud if it was a bad idea. So huge grain of salt with all of that. But I was talking to non-writers about it, and they were like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It was really interesting to see that perspective. I think we're socially at a point where it's like much more acceptable to choose not to have kids, but there's still plenty of people who choose not to have kids who do get a lot of shade for it from, people in their lives. And so, I just had a really hard time pulling apart what I really wanted and what various social pressures were coming at me. And it's tough to figure that one out sometimes. I knew that I was getting, pressures in different directions, and I knew that was going to affect me. And I was trying to make decisions and figure out what I wanted, knowing that was also there.
Yeah.
And knowing that I was, I'm somebody who feels those things and internalizes it. And so trying to figure out what I really wanted was hard. But I had this really kind of dumb moment. It's almost an embarrassing story because my life was in no way in danger, but I was running during what turned into a big thunderstorm, and there was a lot of lightning near me, and I perceived that my life was in danger at that moment, even though retrospectively it totally wasn't. And I had one of those like really melodramatic moments where I was like, oh no. And I was like, but I haven't written a book or had a baby yet. And I was like, well, that's clarifying. Those seem to be two things that you would really like to do. So you may as well try to do both of them.
Take the flash of clarity where you will find it, right?
Yeah.
Growing up, it sounds like how do I want to ask this question? Were you always kind of trying to figure out what you wanted from the time you were young, or did you want one thing when you were growing up and then you sort of switched gears and wanted something else? What did young Meg want? out of
I
life?
think I assumed that I was going to have kids, but I didn't think about it that hard. And then I started making less conventional choices. And once I made one less conventional choice, it went into another one, and my whole community changed. So by my mid-20s, most of my world was comprised of seasonal workers who, definitely were not assuming that they were going to have kids. And so it was less that I had like a conscious thought process with it, and more that it stopped being an assumption. And then I went from that circle to medicine, where I don't know if there were any particular pressures in any direction on that. There was an acceptance. There was an acceptance no matter what I was going to do there. And then the writing world, which we've talked about. Yeah.
That's interesting. The shift in communities and how that impacts what you perceive you want for yourself, or what you should wish for yourself, or what you can't hope for. That's interesting.
Yeah. In my early 30s, I had started thinking about it more. And I said to a friend, like, oh, maybe I'll have a kid. And without kind of like missing a beat, this particular friend was like, don't kowtow to social pressures. And I was like, yep, that's my current community. I had a lot of support for not having kids, I guess, as much as, like pressure in any direction. It was just, you had to think about it. I mean, there's something to be said for, all of this is like, hi, I have tons of choices in life, right? Like there's a lot of privilege that comes out of that whole decision. But,
yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about living in the Navajo Nation and what it's like to mother and to write there, and especially in sort of an isolated community, and in a community that in some ways you sort of indicated you're an outsider in, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's another country. And I would say it's a lot more, I have a very particular place in it. It's a little bit like being an expat in some ways, right? And so, one of the things is I like always want to write about it, and I do not want to write about it because I feel like writing about living on the Navajo reservation as a non-native woman, it's like writing about the country that you study abroad in. I don't really have any authority to talk about it, and so that one's tricky for me. Cat walking into the podcast. So, like for me, it's a little isolated, and I live very far from my family. My family's all in the Northeast in Maine. And for many other people who live here, this is the exact opposite of that. And they're surrounded by their family. It's, it's a much more concentrated version of what I already experienced with medicine, where I want to write about, I feel like inspired to write about things that I observe or learn about from seeing other people's lives, but it's also not my life to write about. So I have to constantly figure out where I fit into that and what I do feel comfortable doing with art.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more, because although I don't have that same situation or frame of reference, I wonder sometimes about being a white, privileged, essentially middle-class woman, and whether my stories have a place, right? Like, so what?
Yeah. White women are what, like 70% of publishing or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. It's like
my voice is out there.
Yeah.
Not necessarily me personally, but yes, me. It's definitely something to think about. Um, and so this is a bit of a tangent, right? But it's also something I've thought about with wanting to write about the experience of being a mother, right? Because it is this crazy experience and I want to write about it. And everything I want to write about it is just so cliche. I don't know if this has happened for you, you know?
Yes.
I was 35 when I got pregnant, and I had been taking care of pregnant people. I had taken care of new moms. And I wanted to get out a megaphone and be like, no, they really kick you. Like, it's wild. Like, you're pregnant and they kick you. And I was like, yes. Like, we know that. Like, I had nothing new to say, but everything that wasn't new that I wanted to say, like, felt huge to me. And so it's been a project of mine, which has so far been wholly unsuccessful in my, note taking of the last 11 months, to try to get down these details and articulate what has been so world shattering about this experience, because it's world shattering, and it is, all of the words are words that I have heard before that did not strike me as world shattering before I experienced them. And what a fun project for a writer, right? Even if I never crack that one. But at a certain point, writing about parenthood is going to be writing about my child, and it's not going, and that's definitely not going to be my story, right? That's their story. But right now it feels like my story. And so that confusion over whose story is it, it comes from, I see that confusion in wanting to write about medicine. I see that confusion in wanting to write about, what it's been like living on the Navajo Nation for 3 years. And then it gets as personal as, how much do I write about my kid? Yeah. And my answer is to write about all of these things, but in my journal.
Exactly. But then it's such a catch-22, isn't it? Because I feel like in literature, motherhood is disparaged, right? Like, women writing about motherhood or womanhood is not serious literature.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, what could be more dramatic or serious than those things? But then how do you write it in a way that's not cliche, even though there isn't actually a place for it in the literary canon? Like, it's such a laden thing to write about motherhood, and to write about it from I feel like a white privileged perspective, which that's such a valid perspective, but it's like, so why add my voice? And it's very fraught, right?
It's like the one thing that's been done, right? You're like,
right.
Oh, no one's done this except for people just like you. And it's like, oh, well. Have you ever seen the movie Fargo?
I've seen the show, but not the movie.
Okay, I'm talking about. I think it's Fargo. It features I think it's a chief of police who's super pregnant the entire movie, and it is not about her being pregnant at all. She just happens to be pregnant, and there's no weird running gags about her forgetting things or throwing up. It was kind of groundbreaking in a way. It was like a movie that featured a pregnant woman that wasn't about pregnancy. And, I don't really know how much of that we've seen since then. If people have other great examples, email them to me, because I'm super curious. But I've been thinking that it would be really fun to write a novel that did that for the postpartum period. And so I've started taking notes where the book has nothing to do with postpartum, totally separate plot points, but the heroine is just walking around in an ice diaper for the first week.
I love that.
I'm hoping.
Yes, you have to write that. Yeah. So how can you do it in a new way that feels revelatory and groundbreaking? I love that.
Yeah, I think the problem might be in the question of how it is that something so that feels so big is also kind of so cliche. And I think when you make it the full topic, it's been hard for me to find art about motherhood when motherhood is the focus that feels like it gets at it. And so I'm trying to come at it indirectly.
Yeah. Tell it slant, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I would love if anyone has examples, as Meg said, please email them to her, but also email me and I'll put them up on the page. Or if you have immediate examples, put them in the comments and I can add them into the conversation, because I
Do
think
you have some favorite books that are concerned with motherhood that you think do it well?
Oh my gosh. See, now you put me on the spot where it's like I'm thinking of every woman who's been on this show who I need to.
Fair. Yeah.
But I'll give an example of somebody who's not on the show, whose name I can never pronounce. Elena Ferrante.
Okay.
Wrote this book that now I'm going to forget the name of. But in any case, it was a woman who's a mother and she has 2 kids, and she's going through some kind of crisis where she can't get out of her apartment with them. And things keep happening that prevent her from leaving the apartment. Like she'll be walking toward the door and notice that like there are dishes in the sink that she has to do. And so she'll do the dishes and then like a glass will break in the sink and she'll cut herself and she needs a Band-Aid. And on the way to get the Band-Aid, like something else happens and like the dog gets poisoned somehow. And then her son is throwing up and like, and then the door won't open and it's unclear as to whether there's a problem with the doorknob or she's forgotten how to open the door. But it's this whole series of like, and it's not about motherhood. She's a mother, but she's not a new mother. It's just this sense that I think we all who are listening can relate to, where you just can't reach like the thing you need to do because there are all these other things in the way, right? And sometimes it feels like you're trapped within this like never-ending cycle of trying to keep your life together. So that's the one I can think of, a person who has not been on this show, because I don't want to forget anyone who has been.
Yeah.
So.
Have you read Lydia Kiesling's book that's like a road trip novel with a small child?
No, tell me more about that one.
I can't remember the title off the top of my head, and I feel bad about that. But it is an experience. It doesn't have a lot of breaks in each page, which just feels so perfect. And every chapter is a single day, and so you start a chapter like a day, and then you just go through it, right, like a Bolaño novel. And then at the end, you're like, oh God. And like that's such the experience of a day, right? You like from those like first waking up to like bedtime once it happens.
And then there's that finally you can sit down for 10 minutes. Yeah.
I think she did a really good job at writing that. I read it before I decided to have a kid, and I still decided to have a kid. It does a good job at capturing both like the exhaustion of that and also the joy.
Yes. Okay. Is it the Golden State?
That's a trick. Yes, that book.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Anna Childs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I need to read that immediately. Days of Abandonment. Thank you. Yes, that's the Elena Ferrante book. And I probably butchered her name because I am terrible with languages, but yes, Days of Abandonment is the other book. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with it's less telling the story of motherhood and more it's settling you in a very disquieting way into the experience of motherhood, right?
Yes.
Where the motherhood isn't the story, but it's like you feel what it feels like to be in this like this car with a child for a road trip, or in this apartment where you can't get the things done you need to get done. Yeah,
I'm seeing people do that with form in a way that I really appreciate.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
Just with what I was saying with the line breaks and the chapters, the structure of that. And that's interesting too, because I when I have talked to women about how their writing has been changed by parenthood, one of the things that several people have said is it was when they started writing in fragments and stitching fragments together, because that was what they were able to do. And in many ways, you know, like on the production end of things, on the writing end of things, this is the opposite. It is not a fragment. It is a long, like, experience of a chapter. And yet, as a reader, it replicates the experience of being a parent for a day so well. So I don't know how she managed that, but it worked really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think form is something I've heard a lot of women say on the show too, is the thing that has changed the most. And exactly what you're saying with fragmentation, and it's like the way we think, right, has changed. Because you can't really follow through with a full thought when you have a child or like a conversation.
Yeah, or at least not one that is of your own, right? Like you can't, or separate. I mean, you certainly have like full, long sentence days, but they are so consumed with another person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, as you said, to look back later when we can see how motherhood impacted our form or our content. But I think, it's interesting to hear, and it's again not generalized or universal, but that motherhood seems to impact form possibly more than content.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah. And definitely leaning more towards fragments for a lot of people out of necessity. I started looking back at this notebook I've been keeping, where I've been doing observations throughout the first 11 months now of my son's life, and I found an entry from September 1st where I was just beating myself up for not working more on my novel.
Yeah.
And he was 8 days old. I read that and just like threw it. I really thought that was a reasonable thing for me to be putting down on paper at that moment. It was like, oh my God, I haven't worked on my novel for a week. And I was like, what,
It's crazy. So when I went to the hospital, you pack your bag and everything.
Yeah.
I packed the pushcart anthology to go to the hospital and give birth.
That's funny.
Why did we do this?
That is really funny. I like that a lot.
Right? And I'm like, oh yes, I'll have time to sit here and read the best, literature from the last year. No.
Yeah.
If anything, I should have read a magazine, and I did not even have the brain space to read a magazine, much less the pushcart anthology.
That is funny. Oh man. Yeah, I had my son at the hospital right here where I work, and so I didn't really have to go that far. I went 200 yards. And because it was during the pandemic, my big, I needed to fixate in on something to worry about, because there's so many things that there's so many things that I was worrying about. One of the things about working in medicine is you have like a lot of the worst case scenarios very vividly in your head because you've seen them, but like, of course you have, because you see the outliers. But I was obsessed with the fear that my partner would have an asymptomatic positive COVID test and then wouldn't be allowed to be with me during labor. And then of course, labor is such an out of time and space experience that I was very glad that he was able to be there for him. But honestly, I was like on a different plane. And so it did not. And it's funny because women who had children were like, honey, it's not going to matter that much. Like it matters, but like how much is it going to matter? And they're kind of right.
They're right. Yes. Yes. Not, of course, to disparage the partners, but it's a very in your own body experience.
Yeah, I mean anyone, like any other human, right? You're very focused on your own experience at that time. Yeah.
Well, for good reason, right? You're pushing another human being out of your.
But thank God you had your push cart.
Yeah, it's sat next to me in my bag for however many days that was. But like, why do we have the expectations? Why did I expect myself to read great literature while giving birth? And why did you 8 days after having a child expect yourself to work on a novel? Like, where does this come from?
And I was really thinking I was being very reasonable when I wrote that down, which also makes me wonder what other unreasonable things I'm expecting of myself right now. I mean, who knows?
Yeah. Well, you're in the thick of it now, too.
Yeah.
I mean, you're 11 months in, and that's like all the big milestones and the, sleep changes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, a lot of mobility happening.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
A lot happening. And I see a cat has joined you.
Yes, it's her turn. I can't I can't say no.
Well, that I think is a good time to turn your attention to your kitty, and we can.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you very much for talking to me.
Oh my gosh, thank you for coming on and for sharing all of your thoughts and your experiences as a new mother and as a nurse practitioner during a really incredible year. And thank you also for all of your work over the last year, keeping people safe. And
thank you. Thank you for having this podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course, Meg. Now stick around afterwards so I can say goodbye. And thank you again for joining us. Bye. And thank you all for joining us tonight. As always, please consider becoming a patron or patroness of the podcast to help me keep this going. You can find out more at the website www.writermothermonster.com. And thank you all. See you next time.